today's webinar and presentation here in person, we got together as a group here, this panel, and came up with a topic, and that topic was quantifying risk assessment in common language, dollars and cents. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'd like to first take a moment and introduce, well, first of all, thank Franklin University and Taylor here for allowing us to come in. Thank you, Taylor. They are doing some incredible things here at the university for cybersecurity and public safety. We're proud to be here. I've been to many of these events, and they're terrific in what they're doing for the students and for the community is terrific. So I'd like to take a moment then to introduce the panel of experts here today. I'm honored to be here with these two gentlemen who I've known for years. I'm with NPG Solutions. My name is Bill Fuller. I'm a managing partner with NPG. We are an IT advisory firm here in Columbus, Ohio. We've been at it for about 10 years. My previous background is 20 plus years in telecommunications and IT with most of the large telecommunications providers, your MCIs. I started out Quest to Sprint, and then I ended up with Time Warner, and then Time Warner Telecom, a stint with Level 3. Covering mainly enterprise space is where my business was. My last client was Chase Bank, and as it relates to cybersecurity, we brought a DDoS solution to the table for them that I believe is still in place. So that's my background. I want to hand it over to Nathan here first, Nathan Boston. He's with Dark Rhino Security, and let you introduce yourself there, Nate.
Yeah, good morning, folks. It's great to see some friendly faces this morning. Again, Nathan Boston, here representing Dark Rhino Security. We're a Columbus-based cybersecurity firm focused on risk consulting. Frankly, our mission in life and goal is really to help organizations we work get their arms around visibility of risk and truly make it a business discussion, not just a product discussion. So that's what we do, and my background stemmed from the Marine Corps doing data communications and translated back into the commercial realm where I started doing business development and sales over the years, most notably with Symantec and specifically in the healthcare sector. So glad to be here this morning, and thanks for
installed, so starting from scratch, as well as the fortunate or unfortunate opportunity to help folks kind of get out of holes that they put themselves into and bring in better frameworks than maybe have been implemented. About 4 years ago, I ended up starting a software company named InfoGPS to kind of address what I thought was a critical part of what we all do here on a daily basis, and that was really kind of the identification of where the information we're trying to secure actually lives on our networks. And so over the past 4 years, we've been using those solutions and trying to help people improve their risk security posture, and that's brought us into relationships here with Nathan and with Bill. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it. So because this subject is got so much information associated with it, and there's so much to talk about, we're going to do our best to get through a lot of data efficiently but effectively so that you can take away at least 1, 2, or maybe 3 things from this discussion today and apply them in your daily lives and your businesses, or even on the consumer side when it comes down to it. Taylor, the arrow button, right? There we go. So as I mentioned, we're in a space today where there's so much disruption out there in this IT world. There's emerging technologies. There's companies coming out left and right. There's a shortage of IT talent. So these 2 gentlemen here beside me and myself, we're in a space where we act as trusted advisors. We come to the table and help you and your organizations through the midst of the struggles you have just trying to get through your daily tasks. But we bring the information to the table, we bring solutions to the table, and that's what you would get from these 2 gentlemen here and myself with our organizations. So I wanted to start today by just asking the big question to the audience and the group. The cost of cyber crime today is predicted to be what? Can anybody throw out, for those that are here, what would you think that number is going to be predicted to be by the year 2021? Just throw out a guess, whatever you think. It's a high number. Keep going. Add a T in single digits. So the prediction is $6 trillion by 2021. That was a good guess. You get the prize. Taylor will get him a prize at the end here. $6 trillion. It's hard to put your mind around that. So as we go through this session today, and we're going to be asking some pointed questions to this panel, we're going to prime you here with a few of these slides, but just give some thought as to what's going on out there. $6 trillion. So some of those cyber hacks and breaches, this is some data here just to give you an indication of what's happened. You see Yahoo with 500 million users. I think everybody remembers when TJ Maxx, 100 million. So just take a look at that, and that just gives you the indication as to what's going on when these criminals are out there attacking and wanting your data and your information. This is another statistic that is just phenomenal. When you look at 2019, we're at 27 billion connected devices. So when you're looking at cyber crime, it's no wonder with this many devices and all of our private information, corporate information, and all of that intellectual property, why criminals want it. They want to use it for getting to your pocketbooks. IHS Markit predicts 125 billion devices by the year 2030. That's just something that it's hard to wrap your mind around. So keep that as a thought as we go through this session as well. In an internet minute, you may have seen these depictions, graphics out on the web. It's just absolutely incredible. The one that jumps out at you is the 400% increase from 2017 to 2018 in Netflix hours watched in 1 minute of time. That's a 400% increase, 70,000 hours in a minute to 266,000 in a minute. Keep that in mind as we go through this. Cybersecurity, every organization, it affects every company, every organization, every consumer in the marketplace today. Please keep that in mind as we go through these questions today. So as I mentioned a moment ago, hackers want your data. They want your identity, they want your dollars, and they're going to do everything they can to make it difficult on you. I have problems on my computer left and right when the virus gets in or what have you. I got to restart. It's a delay in your day. Can you imagine what happens to organizations such as Chase Bank or these large enterprises that get flooded with attacks? So keep that in mind as we go through this today. Keep also in mind that there's so many different avenues of which you're being attacked. Cybersecurity today, tremendously complex. These gentlemen will share that with you in their daily lives and what they're dealing with their clients and their customers as well as we go through this. Another statistic to keep in mind, 30% of all global companies will have been directly attacked in some way, shape, or form by cybercrime and cyber criminals. So every organization has to be effective in cybersecurity. It's an ongoing process. We're going to talk about that in just a moment with these questions as well. So what's a CISO to do? You got to do all of these things. They say CISOs never sleep. Security professionals never sleep. And it's only going to get worse. And the talent pool, as I mentioned earlier, that's what's so wonderful about Franklin here. They're bringing cybersecurity education to the forefront, and we're going to need as many of you folks out there that have this intelligence to help protect us as the time goes on. Prepare, plan, and test. Ultimately, you got to assess, quantify security risk in dollars and cents, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So let's get started with our first question for these gentlemen. Question one, we're going to focus on top risks. So, if organizations today would identify security gaps and their impact on their business, and at the same time ensure they have the proper budget allocated accordingly to manage these risks, companies' risks would be able to be reduced, and the dollars associated would be reduced as well. So I'm going to pass this off to you, Nate, first. So let's talk about what you two, and Paul, you chime in as well, what you two are seeing out there as the top risks today in the market.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a quick plug here in how Paul and I got connected. So for years when I was at Symantec, one of the things we would do is we would use a data loss prevention tool to do a risk assessment, right? Basically what that would do is involve a scan of the environment to identify sensitive data assets. So you would take that information, maybe you saw it in motion leaving the organization, maybe you saw it at rest in storage or on a device. But the tough part about it was you could certainly find that data and illustrate it, but now it's like, okay, what's the next step? What controls are around that data, right? How do you get visibility into those types of things? So, over the past year and almost a year and a half, we've been doing risk assessments, but geez, probably about a year ago, Bill introduced me to Paul, and this is kind of how we all came together, but I sat down with Paul and, he showed me, his tool and what they were doing. So we've actually implemented what he was doing into our processes, but what it did that I'd never seen before was bring value to that data, right? Not only value where you could quantify the risk in dollars by a third-party report such as Ponymon or the Verizon data breach report, that type of thing, or you could actually put in your own value and what the cost would be to your organization. So how we help customers is we want to understand where their data is at and then try to assign a value to it, and then also figure out what controls, what are your standards, right, for either your own security policies or your governance that you have to attest to, whether it's PCI, HIPAA, et cetera. Now let's map those controls to that data, right? And oh, by the way, when you talk about what we find being the biggest challenge out there is frankly just security hygiene, right? security hygiene of making sure that you have that endpoint protection, or that endpoint encryption, or you have that encryption where you need to have it. And what I will tell you is that we've worked with a lot of organizations where when they do their risk assessment or their governance attestation, they put the check in the box, right? Oh yeah, I got all these devices encrypted. But what we have found, and Paul could talk more to this, is that we have found assets with millions of dollars of very sensitive PHI where they were putting the check in the box, and guess what? They didn't have the basic controls in there, and they were attesting to that. So that is really where we try to focus and go in and say, hey, what are you guys, what is your concern? What are you doing? What are your IT leaders telling you? And I think the important thing about that approach is having that outside firm or consultant. I believe this in life, and I believe this in business, especially in cybersecurity, is that you have to have a team of advisors that you frankly trust and can give you the honest truth and allow you to really look at yourself in the mirror in your environment. And that's not a knock on IT employees or whatever they're doing, but the reality is that we're human beings. We make mistakes, and you got to have checks and balances. So hopefully that answered your question there, Bill.
Oh, fantastic. I don't know what I have to add to that, but we'll go to Earl. So I kind of see top risks kind of breaking down into three major overall categories. So we could specifically say ransomware is a top risk. We could specifically say failure to maintain proper patch update processes across all your applications is a top risk. But really what we're saying is that there are some basic fundamental things that we need to be doing every day in our environments. And when we fail to do the fundamentals, the cyber hygiene side, then the problems arise. So I would challenge you as you start to see news articles or talk within your peer groups about breaches that occurred or losses that your peers are experiencing, and you'll very quickly drive down to a laptop was left without physical protection, a password was not changed or it was not long enough, a patch was not applied on a system, training systems use production data and are not secured in the same way. So we see some of those hygiene things. So that's one. The second that I would talk about is IT, unfortunately, and this is just an opinion that I've kind of generated over time, really is afraid to say that we don't know everything. And we generally approach conversations as I'm doing enough, I'm safe, I don't need to do any more. I actually had an opportunity the other day for somebody to say, hey, I just don't think that there's anything else that we could possibly do to be safer. And you can certainly challenge those statements from folks, but I think there's just a general lack of awareness that there is a lot more that can be done. And being able to make sure that you appropriately take a look at the risks related to your unique environment, let you make that decision in a more comprehensive fashion. So we got to be able to admit that there's other things that we can do. Doesn't mean you have to buy every product that comes down the pike. But we are in a changing environment, and what is good today is not good tomorrow. That also leads then to kind of my third point, and that is historically we've also grown up looking at risks from the outside in. And what we're trying to do is protect an internal set of assets, people, hardware, software, data, policies, things like that. And we start way on the outside, and we try to build these really thick layers before we come in. I think the industry really needs to kind of take a look at transitioning that to 180 degrees. And asset-based, whatever you choose your asset to be, but asset-based risk assessments and asset-based approaches to controls are really going to help you kind of isolate spending in a more appropriate and efficient fashion. And you're going to be able to actually say we have controlled or we have appropriately protected some of these assets that we fail to protect in the first place. So those three things. Admit that we have to kind of look outside ourselves, cyber hygiene, and do a 180 on how we start to look at risk, start from the inside and work from that way out.
Thank you, Paul, Nate. Excellent information. So that leads right into the topic of assessments, which will take us to our question 2. In today's cyber world, risk assessments have become paramount for every organization in order that they can provide assurance that all the relevant risks have been taken into account and a plan is in place to address the risk associated with the vulnerabilities, and the remediation is properly aligned to those risks. So with that said, can you give us some insight in overall, how would you rate or what would you say that organizations today are doing as it relates to conducting comprehensive information security risk assessments and how vital it is to their organization to do so? I'll pass this off to Paul first.
We're switching. All right, fantastic. So to answer that, I'm going to read a brief statement here by the Security and Exchange Commission that was shared with me actually last night, and this came out about a week ago. U.S. State SEC, Division of Enforcement, so this would be for public companies, folks with, trading on exchanges, investigated whether certain public issuers that were victims of cyber-related frauds have been violated or may have been violated, and the company is violating their federal security laws by failing to have sufficient systems of internal accounting controls over cyber vulnerabilities. And so I think what they're trying to say there is we have to be able to understand what sufficiency means. We have to be able to understand what our vulnerabilities are in terms of our unique environments. And that starts with the precipice for the question, which was a risk assessment and how we see this being approached. So if we start at the small, medium size, and then we kind of move up to the more complex environments, small, medium size, I mean, generally we're saying, do a search on Google, find a spreadsheet, see if it has a couple of things in it that I understand, and I'm going to put in a couple of scores, high, moderate, and low, and then I'm going to say I did a risk assessment. And really all I have done is filled out somebody else's spreadsheet to try to get to an answer, to Nathan's point, where I can check a box. When we see these things mature, we see them break out into some pretty specific categories. That first category being, what is management's assumption of what their appetite for risk is? So that's literally a document that the board or executive management says, we are willing to accept these types of risks and or maybe a little bit more fuzzy. Before we make a major decision, we're going to have a specific cybersecurity conversation, okay? Secondarily, then we see an evaluation unique again to that organization as to what they feel they are subject to in terms of vulnerabilities and or threats. So I can't tell you the number of times that I've looked at threat statements here in Northeast Ohio and hurricanes are on the list. And I just don't think that that's an appropriate view. And that just indicates that they probably just went and got a public list and they went after it. But we've also had people say, well, I'm not in a major city, so I'm probably not subject to state actors. Well, we also know that that may not necessarily be true with kind of the breadth of how vulnerabilities are thrown out, So that second step is really what are we viewing as threats to our internal systems, getting an accurate inventory then of those systems so we can identify the vulnerabilities. And then we end up with a threat vulnerability pair, right? And then we can start to say what asset is going to be put at risk for that. Those are pretty specific steps, right? At that point, then we can start to make different decisions. What framework do we want to use to evaluate risk? Whether it's the FAIR model that kind of gets down to economics that these guys at Dark Rhino do, whether it's high, moderate, and low, whether it's NIST in terms of a confidentiality score, integrity score, right? Those are very specific steps. So as we walk upstream, I think what you'll see is the folks that are best prepared, not only to address risks, but to respond to them if something should happen, are those that have stopped going to Google and started to just sit down and take a methodological approach to compartmentalizing those risk views.
Paul did a great job of covering the strategic overview there. I know we're going to have a next question, but to get more tactical, I think the answer is no, to be more straightforward. And I think that's because the dynamics of cybersecurity are not only a business discussion, and that's what we have to make it to the organization. At the same time, what we have going on in the industry is a 3 million person shortage and proficiency issue, where when you look at the tactical controls and the room for error that comes with human beings, the reality is, again, I'll kind of reiterate it, is that you need someone to help you even once you figure out what those controls and policies are and all that governance that goes with it, that's the heavy lifting. You still need that technical expertise that can come in and verify those controls are there, right? And if those controls are addressing the vulnerabilities in your environment. So you got to constantly do, again, the vulnerability, assess your controls, and then all the other policy stuff goes into it. But again, that goes into the bigger framework or how you assess that, right? But what I will tell you is that our experience is, and even if you look at, again, I'll reference like the Verizon data breach reports and some of those third parties, configuration is a big issue as well. So my point being is that even when we go into an organization and they've done their risk assessment, there's still configuration errors we see. And oh, by the way, the other thing I would tell you is, diversify your risk assessments, right? So you may do a risk assessment from maybe it's fair or a NIST assessment or a PCI, or maybe it's a pen test, whatever it is, right? Try something different the next time around and talk to that strategic advisor organization. And there's basic hygiene questions that you can ask, right? When was the last time we had a firewall health check? Tell me the percentages of my clients out there that have the mandated endpoint protection, and what is the percentage of those devices that are encrypted? Well, how many mobile users do we have? How many users do we have that aren't behind our firewall, and what are we doing to protect them from ransomware and some of these advanced attacks that come when people are mobile? So those are some of the things I think from a tactical level that could add to Paul's response.
That's excellent information. The other thing that I thought of while you were talking earlier, Paul, too, on the subject of IT professionals and how they handle cybersecurity and risks in the organizations and where they may go. Today it is a corporate, it is a whole organizational thing, to the board down through the presidents and CEOs, down through the CISOs and security professionals and IT group, where everybody really needs to be involved in this process. And we spoke about that earlier. So let's go on to question 3, testing. We just talked about testing and how important it is. So when you're talking earlier about prevention and testing as prevention, we know today that vulnerabilities occur on a daily basis, and you got to be prepared for that. Most companies in general, and I think you shared that earlier, fail to conduct those regular tests, especially penetration tests, and falsely assuming that, as you said, the company is safe. So we touched on risk assessments in the last question, and that leads into regular testing. So what exactly would you say is meant by regular testing? And this is a two-part question. You get 2 for 1. And what types of testing should be performed on a regular basis? I'll hand this to you, Nate.
Yeah, what we see is most people, there's a commodity pen test out there that everyone does, right? Maybe it's mandated, maybe they do it every once in a great while. The challenge with penetration tests are they become just that. They become a commodity. We're desensitized to them. And the reality is that if you have a good penetration tester coming in, guess what? Most likely he's going to get in some way, somehow. And what we see is people continue to do those pen tests year in and year out. The board or whoever it is gets desensitized, like, oh yeah, we already knew that. We knew we were vulnerable there, and maybe they take on that risk and they're willing to take it on. But the reality is that, to go back to the theme of the presentation today, dollars and cents, right? And cents can be common sense. That's why we spelled it with the SE in SE. But it really comes down to understanding those assets and that data, what their value is to your organization. And secondly, apply common sense. And what I mean by that is, if you got millions of dollars of sensitive data here, and there's lots of duplication of that data, and there's permissions to that data to everyone in the organization, and you don't have controls around that data, then it becomes common sense. And I know that sounds very elementary, but the reality is that I would say most organizations, one of those doors is wide open, right? Whether it's identity access management, whether it's just controls, or just even a lack of a program whatsoever. The reality is that that's really where it comes down to, being able to put a value to your data and communicate that. And then there's the common sense part, right? And that's the hard part that becomes a communication process with leadership and the board.
So very good. So I'd say that there's going to be a couple of specific things that we'd want to see
every time we walk in somewhere, whether we have to create it or it already exists. And so that is IT is following in the footsteps of folks that have come before us on the financial and operational audit side of the house, and they have things like audit plans and audit cycles, where they identify the tests that they are going to do and how often they are going to do them, and what the response to those tests needs to be. So in the information security, cybersecurity world, I very specifically think that there needs to be an audit plan that says we will do an external penetration test twice a year. We will do an internal social engineering exam once every 24 months. Whatever that cycle is based on your risk assessment, we have these specific plans that we do. Now, on a daily basis, again, following in the footsteps of other folks, I cut my teeth early working for a bank, and I could tell you that we knew where every penny in the bank was every day. And we knew that because we opened up the vault. We knew that because we counted it. We knew that because we knew who could access the money and who could spend the money. We knew that because every single person that touched the money had to balance their drawer every day. And then we had people in the accounting department who looked for unbalanced situations. And then we had the CFO make sure that the general ledger balanced. And then we had the CFO report to the board on a standardized framework, on a standardized routine periodically that got independently audited by another person. Well, I think we can use those practices inside. So on the IT side, find your inventory. What assets do you have? Do you make these up? Are they on an Excel spreadsheet, or do you use some kind of tool that understands what's connecting to your network right now? Pretty easy to say until you start bringing in IoT. Does your tool connect to IoT devices? Do you know what's on those things? What software are you running? Do you let people run local administrator? So testing access. Well, if you let them run local admin, then your software controls probably are pretty weak because people can change them tomorrow. The other thing that we have to understand, I believe, is that the biggest asset that we have really in terms of exposure to the company if there's something that happens to it is information, right? So it's not the building. If you take the dollar amounts of records that are lost, and the $6 trillion mark there is a pretty scary number concerning what we're going to lose, we have to be able to understand kind of where those pockets of risk lie and then track those specific pockets. So daily access reviews for critical systems, less often access reviews for less critical systems. So let's define critical. I think you'll also find that as we move to the cloud and into the IoT environment, that things like configuration controls, like Nathan said, become absolutely critical components, which used to be something we might test once a year in an audit. Are you running an AWS cloud right now? Well, someone better look at that configuration, because as soon as you put it up there, a lot of that stuff becomes public. And those are really, really important steps as we kind of take what we thought was the edge of our network. We introduce tools and cloud solutions to it, which means our network now has no edge to it. And we are really reliant upon patching access and configuration controls over our sensitive assets. So your tests need to involve those things.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, so the regular testing, again, it goes back to where you set the policy, what's it going to be, but don't do the same thing every time. Do it yearly, maybe it's quarterly, just depending on the resources and the team you have. But just don't do a pen test every year. Diversify it. Look at some of the things that we're talking about, whether it's, asking yourself those tough questions on the inventory and the vulnerability and the patching and those types of things. Because I will tell you, most organizations we go into, patching, like, it's a major issue. It's a major issue. And when you go in and you do a scan, you find 27 critical vulnerabilities, and then, you're looking at the egress points and you got people scanning that environment, right, and targeting those vulnerabilities, then you got problems, right? And one of the things that we do is called a network threat assessment, where we can actually put a technology in tap, right, in tap mode, or in a core switch to where we just go in monitor mode, so it's not in line. And then we'll look at what's going on in your environment across vulnerabilities, across activity, user behavior, and then also any malicious activity of threat actors that have been scanning your environment. And what you find, sometimes we don't find much, but sometimes we find a lot. So that's a huge thing, being able to have someone come from the outside, or maybe you bring an alternative technology in just to assess the environment as well. So another alternative for you.
So not to belabor the point, but making sure we do different scopes every time we do a test, or kind of alternating it, is really important. And I'll offer two reasons why. So one, in this space, the cybersecurity space, which we're all interested in, we really are the only people in the world who are protecting an asset that can be stolen and we don't know it. Okay? So if somebody comes in and they take the money out of the safe, it's not there on Monday morning and everybody knows. Somebody comes in and steals data, they really copy it, right? And it's gone, but you still have access to the asset that lets you do your daily business, which is why it takes so long to find these things out. So if you're repetitively doing the exact same test over and over again, it is highly likely that you're going to find the exact same things right and the exact same things wrong every time you do a scope. I'd also say that although we've often, in the, I guess, accounting space, come out and said, look, management cannot outsource its assumption of risk. It has to make that decision on its own. IT changes so frequently that it's almost impossible to maintain that knowledge inside an organization unless you specifically have a part of your department whose job it is to stay on top of cybersecurity. So if you're going to be a bank, be a bank. You're probably not a cybersecurity expert. If you're going to be software developers, you're probably good at that, but you probably aren't good at access, right? And getting outside folks to come in and give you those fresh views become extremely important. And the last thing I'll say, and I think this is really where we all have jobs for life, to make a joke, is we don't have enough money in the economy to maintain our systems at current levels, period. Which means legacy is always going to be an issue, period. And which means that the folks that are trying to find ways to break in have a very soft surface or a threat surface in which they can begin to take advantage of things that maybe weren't vulnerable last year. So the new software that you buy today or the new PC that you buy today is going to be secure today. It will be insecure at least 12 months from now, maybe sooner, depending on if it happens to be the attack target of somebody, which literally means that if you are doing the same thing over and over and over again, your threat surface is getting wider and wider and wider because you're testing old things against new threats.
And one of the ways you can bring the business to the table in these new tests, right, the decision makers, the board, is we have to think of our operations in cybersecurity as we have to get into the nitty gritty. And what I mean is we have to think of it like a military operation, right? So if we do that assessment where you figure out where your sensitive data is, now maybe you have that red team approach or that pen tester come in and say, hey, we know our sensitive assets are here. We want you to focus this test specifically on these assets. Find the vulnerability and get to those assets, and then lay down a sample exploit and test to see if you could get ransomware into that NAS or that file depository or that endpoint, that critical endpoint. When you start doing those types of things and you stop just looking at things as high-level pen test, we're going to do our pen test this year, and really start focusing on the crown jewels and how a thief would come steal them, then you're talking about truly fulfilling security operations. And the other thing that you can do in that table, bring the board to that meeting, right? So when you go through that tabletop exercise, let's take healthcare, for example, a vertical near and dear to my heart. But we had a sample thing that came out where, let's pretend, and gosh forbid, but imagine that a healthcare organization has a doctor, a clinician that was frankly associated, let's just say, with something horrific, and you can use your imagination on what might happen there and people's behavior and what they do on their computers and on the internet. But let's pretend for a second this healthcare organization has a doctor that gets associated with pornography or something like that on their computers. And again, gosh forbid, right? We don't like to think that way as human beings because I think most of us are naturally good, but that stuff exists in the world. And you as an organization, how are you going to respond to that? Because now you're having to do forensics. People are asking questions. That is incident response to the business as well. That is risk to your business. So doing those types of tabletop exercises and getting creative, right? That's really where you bring ideas to the table that people can understand, the board can understand. You're not talking zeros and ones. Now you're talking about true impact to the business.
That was a good question. Great dialogue there, gentlemen. We appreciate that. We're going to go on to our fourth question. And by the way, if you have some questions that you've thought of, please write them down. We're going to be around. If we have time, we want to cover your questions as well. So bring those to the forefront and ask those with the time we have allotted, and then we'll be around afterwards. We want to make sure every question is answered that you may have today. right, question 4. We can. Yeah, does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask at this point? Sure. Anyone online, will you be handling? Okay, yeah. Anybody online that has a question as well, please type that in, and Taylor will get that to us. I'm going to pass the microphone out here into the audience local and ask your question out.
Thank you, gentlemen. My name is Alan Perk. I'm CEO of Excellent Systems and an advocate for small business. What can a small business do? And we're talking, even a micro small business of 10 employees, but let's say 25 to 30 employees. What can they do? Give me 1 or 2 things that they should look for or to do to help improve their cyber defenses.
Great question. Nate?
What we have found is small businesses, not only is there risk to them nowadays, much to your point, Alan, is that it does affect every organization out there. But what we're finding is small business nowadays, their affiliations and who they do business with, they are also handling very sensitive assets. And we've seen that. And what you find with a startup or an SMB or a smaller business, many times their practices are going to the local Best Buy, right? Buying a router, or a cheap firewall, or maybe it's consumer-based antivirus or what have you. They don't even know, and they're like, oh, well, there's BitLocker on this. But once you go in there and you look at the devices, they're not actually implementing those controls. So what I would tell you is we take the approach of it starts at the beginning. When you're a small business, you can solve these problems in the very beginning. Work with a business-related organization that can create a process of how you procure your assets. Let's say it's your endpoints, some servers, what have you. So the first thing I would tell you is create a process in building your business or your IT. Look for a good partner to help you procure those and make sure that the controls that you need based upon your vertical and what you do are there, right? But also, there's also cloud partners. I think cloud's a whole nother discussion we could go into. But with the cloud, you do have some security and scale options there. And again, I can go further into that, Alan, but you probably have some great input there as well.
So I guess I'd suggest that if we start, the lower that we go, the more dollars make a whole lot of impact on the internal, and trying to get somebody to say, this is a $25,000 project to review X, isn't going to go very far, you go to a small office. So what we've tried to do is say, look, let's make sure you have a relationship in 2 areas. One is know what you're good at, what are you in business for, and if IT's not it, then go get the local network folks, the local office management folks to help you provide the backup, the antivirus, the cloud security, I need a PC, they know what it's supposed to be, they set it up and they bring it in based on your standards, right? So go do that, and that is fairly reasonable. The second is, and we do this from time to time, is just set up a really small recurring maybe expense on your account where somebody comes in once a month and just does a quick hygiene check. So 2 hours a month from somebody whose life is cybersecurity goes a long, long, long way. Right, and that can be done really quickly. Somebody comes in and they install a tool and we get all your network config. Somebody comes in and they make sure that patches are updated in all your systems. Somebody comes in and does training and said, let's talk about phishing right now, and spends an hour with staff. And I'd also say that, you have customers that use your systems that put you at risk if they do something wrong often. And so extending that opportunity out to say, pick your top 10 customers or whatever and have your cybersecurity partner go train them. Pay for the coffee and donuts or the small lunch and have them train your partners, your customers that put you at risk as well so that they know where they're at. Does that answer your question?
The other thing, and I don't want this to sound like a sales pitch, but when we started Dark Rhino Security, we saw this as a big issue. What do SMBs do? And you touched on it. You hear the terms virtual CISO or the hours, bundled hours to help you with that. But there's also what you can do nowadays with what's called MSP, managed service providers, like Dark Rhino Security, for example, is there's certain things we see that are trends like cloud, like endpoints, right? What's happening in there is having potentially an SMB partner that monitors your network or gives you a few hours per month, but then they're also looking at the activity of your controls right, from the edge to the endpoint. Maybe it's your firewall service, maybe it's your endpoint protection, your endpoint encryption, or maybe it's a newer control because of all the cloud business you do, like cloud access security broker, right? Technologies. So today, for example, with Dark Rhino, we created a stack, a one custom stack where it addresses the major pain points of the SMB and is a fulfilled service, one SKU service. So just creative approaches out there. It's good to have that collaboration.
The other thing that I'll add to that, Alan, is that just making sure you have a line item in your budget for cybersecurity. That's something that when you look at small, medium-sized businesses, you got to address that. And it would be under the IT side, but it's got to be there. The budget is important. You got to have budgeted funds. One thing we didn't talk about in that $6 trillion is how many hundreds of billions of dollars are going into cost to protect against the risk. I mean, you kind of alluded to that a little while ago, that is something very, very important to take into account. The other thing is checkers and chess. This was, you kind of led right into question 4 here. You don't want to play checkers. You don't want to wait for the event to happen, because the old phrase, the new phrase, the phrase in today's cybersecurity is if you haven't been hacked yet, you are going to be hacked at some point in time. We know that there's viruses. I guarantee you there's something on my computer right now that's sitting in some registry file or something. What's that? Yeah. So, well, but I'm just saying there's something there or someone trying to get into one of my files. I have antivirus, as Paul said, but that's what I have these guys for. And then also, Alan, trusted advisors. I mean, that's what MPG Solutions brings to the table. We bring these types of folks into your business to help you. Great question. You had a question too?
Yeah, I'm Rick Hulse from Rampart. I had a question pertinent to your kind of common sense approach. And when we look at basic network assessments and kind of high level testing and things like that, we get a lot of information there. But the more interesting part I thought was getting into the configuration piece. And what kind of, I know there's no magic bullet there, but what kind of process and approach do you do for really getting a little bit deeper dive into the configuration part? What kind of process do you use? Looking for just maybe there's one radio button somewhere, someplace that an assessment's not going to pick up. What's your process there?
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate that. I'll throw this to Paul first.
Threw it to the risk guy first. This is going to be so I do 3 things. First, and I'll start from kind of top of the pyramid down, right? So the first thing I do is, and I've done this if I've had to train folks coming on board or try to discuss cybersecurity with folks, is get me to the dollars. So what's your risk? Get me to the dollars. And if you can't get me to the dollars, we either need to talk further about it to get you there, or maybe it's just not something that is high enough up on the scale to get to. So not to belabor the point, but if the radio button is on a system that has no path to dollars, then I'm probably going to worry about it less than my internet banking side, right? Or my patient electronic health records portal. So then the second is, I probably didn't write the application. So I'm going to look for some independent outside audit teams that have looked at it. Now, most folks are going to say, okay, a third-party audit review, a SOC review is what they're called, or SSAE 18 review, something like that. I'm talking more specifically about, was the code reviewed, right? And so when we look at some of these risk or governance controls reports, they do really good at access, change control, policies and procedures, but who looked at the code? All right, who told me what the code was doing, which should check that radio button somewhere down in the set, right? And then the third is, I think you really just have to kind of get down to a point where I just don't know anymore. I don't have the talent to know anymore, so I have to go and find outside expertise, which is where I get to, right? Nathan is much more technical than I am. And so I need to go get at some outside expertise. I've gotten to the point where I think the top 5 layers are pretty good, but now I really don't have a clue what's going on if I dig any deeper to speak about it intelligently. So I'm going to go get an outside expert, or I'm going to buy a tool that's specifically meant to do that. And I won't name any tools here, but getting into that code level is probably one of the most important steps you can take between the governance side and then actually what each radio button might be doing when you get down. So those would be the 3 steps.
Yeah, I'll give a story. It was Rick, right? So I'll give you a story where we did an incident response engagement when I was at Symantec, and one of the reasons we do what we do on our front end assessment is because um, typically, if you have some really good incident response guys, I mean, these guys are really sharp. So we did an incident response engagement, and when we came out of it, we had a briefing afterwards, right, of some of the findings, and the CISO was floored because what our team had shared with her was that when they came in and they looked at the configurations of their some of the most basic and controls such as firewalls and endpoint protection, there were certain things. The configuration that had been copied over wasn't was from the old configuration of a different manufacturer of a different firewall. And then we also find things that aren't turned on the endpoint protections solutions or the firewalls. So, to kind of give you an example, there's all the different next generation firewall vendors have these advanced either web URL filtering or advanced next generation scanning for malware scanners, right? But same thing like on the endpoint. When I was at Symantec, we would find all the time people would have their endpoint protection misconfigured. Because what's happened over the years is new controls and new technologies have been added to those agents or those firewalls. But what has happened is people used to think, oh, I got antivirus on it, it's all good, right? Well, guess what? I can tell you at Symantec, for example, antivirus, signature-based antivirus was only catching about 40% of the threats out there. So when you looked at the other technologies like the network IDS, IPS that they built into that endpoint protection, it was catching much more, right, than your standard antivirus. And I go back to why that's important. If you look at the threat reports, the number of instances, both from a 0-day perspective, as well as just individual malware, it has skyrocketed to where I think in the early 2000s, it was like 400,000. And by, 2000 umpteen something, it was like millions. I mean, it's nearly 2 million signatures per day. So, I mean, that's crazy. You can't keep up. So you got to make sure your whatever you're using at the perimeter of the endpoint is advanced and that you're updating it and doing that health check.
Thank you, gentlemen. Rick, great question. We've got in the hour about 3 minutes left. Taylor, were there any questions that came in from the web? Okay, so back to what I said earlier about my computer. He just basically verified that only 40% of some of these great companies' antiviruses are catching stuff. So, and that's why they do regular patches, updates, and all that good stuff. So we've got just a couple minutes left. Any other questions from anybody out here? Anybody have anything that they'd like to share or ask? Okay, so I want to then turn to these two SMEs, we'll call them, that are full of information and ask you to round out this session with the last question, be question 5. And that is, let's talk about survival real quick. Just round out what we've talked about today and what companies in your mind are going to be the ones that are going to survive that breach that we know is going to happen at some point in time. I'll start with you, Nate.
Yeah, I think I go back to the analogy of we have to treat cybersecurity like it is a military operation. We have to go through those live fire exercises and really sit down. It's like anything else in life today, right? We're so busy focused on the noise and the reactive natures of our world today that we often forget to be reactive, right? So failing to plan, right, is like planning to fail, right? I mean, you hear that analogy all the time, right? But I think it's true. So when we have a plan, first we got to understand what our critical sensitive assets are in that data. Just like anything else, if we're guarding something or we're trying to protect something, we have to take the approach both on the defensive as well as the offensive, right? And I'll give you an example. When we went, what the military learned from the exercises in Iraq, first tour over there, right? The IEDs, and we're hitting the Humvees and the whole 9 yards, and people were getting killed. And the mount training, or the urban warfare training, frankly, we weren't doing a great job at it. We didn't know what to do when that IED went off and then there was live fire from the sides and effector fire. And Marines are very good at that. But at the same time, until you go through that exercise, until that game day is there, you don't know how you're going to react. So what they did in my second tour when we went into Iraq is we spent a lot of time in San Diego going through the live fire exercises where they had block buildings, right? And you're going through a Humvee, through your Humvees in a convoy, and you take a hit, right? And then obviously we would react to that situation and go take out, the targets or whatever in those buildings. But, when you think it as cybersecurity that way, then I think you'll be more effective. That's just my approach. But again, it's such a virtual world nowadays, and it's hard to get our arms around all these scenarios and threats.
So if the question is, what's the critical difference between organizations that survive a data breach and those that won't? So we infer that they have been breached, right? So a couple things. One is, has that organization partnered with somebody that can go through an exercise of, if this happens, what would you do? Those are called incident response tests, sometimes called tabletop tests. They're very short in period, but they highlight a lot of things that you might expect to be occurring that you just don't know. I'll give you one right now. Does anybody in this room know who they're going to call as their attorney in a cybersecurity event today? If the answer is no, we got a couple that says yes. If the answer is no, that's a question you should ask yourself. Why do you care? Well, there's a lot of client attorney privilege stuff that happens in an event, right? And should I even use the word breach, right, is another one, right? So those things happen. The second is have you had somebody that's been looking at your environment like a virtual CISO or something if your expenses, need to be maintained? But I would say the most important thing about survival is, do you know what affects your business? And as an example, I know 3 or 4 people in this room run security companies. If you get breached, you're out of business because that's what you sell, right? And so reputation risks for you are much more valuable than the accumulation of personal data inside your network. In fact, most security companies probably don't have sensitive data about you inside their network, right? And so I think you just have to understand that. If you are a retail space like Amazon and the data breach causes your website to be unavailable for 3 hours, that is hundreds of millions of dollars of lost revenue, right? And so you have to be able to understand what the risk is that puts your business into a going concern position. If you've done that, then I think you survive. If you haven't done that, I think you're, kind of throwing your arms in the water and hoping that you learned how to swim early enough, right? So that's what I'd say. It's all planning. You want to get out of it, you have to plan for it.
I would just add to the documentation. When you look at what's happening, even with impacts to businesses with fines, let's take healthcare again as an example, and what's happening with the Office of Civil Rights, HHS, where people get upset and where awareness is coming. People are starting to understand cybersecurity and the risk to their individuals. But just like as Yar wants to see, they want to make sure that you do have that plan that I talked about, but that you have it documented. So there's a HIPAA risk analysis, for example, that you have to have done yearly within healthcare. And if you don't have that and have that documented well, you're going to have a huge impact, not only from consumers or patients that work with you, but also you're going to have fines from the government. So documentation.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think it was a great conversation today. We really appreciate the participation. I'll leave you with just a couple things. Every organization, every size, every sector has to deal with cybersecurity. Effective cybersecurity is an ongoing process. We showed one slide earlier, the NIST slide, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology slide. It talked about prepare, plan, and test. It talked about everything going from identifying assets, which you mentioned numerous times today, preparing, and then being able to recover when that breach happens. So with all that said, thank you all for joining us this morning for this forum, this panel discussion, this excellent information on cybersecurity. And again, we wish to thank Franklin University and Taylor for having us in. Do you have anything you'd like to say, Taylor, to close out?
Just thank you to our panel of experts for coming today. For anyone interested in future events, you can follow the center on LinkedIn or Facebook, and we post all of our events there. And just thank you again to our presenters.